Hey everybody, I'm Matt Valley. Welcome to episode number 107 of the Rock and Roll Research Podcast, where we share the super cool backstories and side gigs of the research and insights pros that you trust. Well, hey, I'm super excited because today I'm joined by Dave McCaughan, who joins us from his home base in Bangkok, Thailand. It's a first Bangkok-based guest, so super excited about that. Now, many of you know that Dave is a speaker, writer, and consultant focusing on all things related to the relationship between people and brands and media, all that good stuff. You probably also know that he spent a real good chunk of his career at the McCann agency, McCann Worldwide, as a brand strategy planner and other executive roles in really cool, far-flung Asia-Pacific cities such as Tokyo and Bangkok, Thailand, or Bangkok, Hong Kong, Sydney, right?
Yep.
So cool stuff, and has long been involved in ESOMAR, however you want to say it. We just had a little debate about that. But you probably know him from ESOMAR if you don't know him from McCann or any other place that you may have heard him in a research space. So what a lot of people don't know about Dave, though, is that advertising and strategy was not his first career. And there's a really fun story about that. We're going to cover that and a whole lot more in today's podcast. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this. It's a fun podcast you have, man. And in the world of super serious market research, it's good to see somebody that is always cracking for some fun. It's good.
Well, I very much appreciate that. And I have to, before we jump in and get started, I have to give a shout out to our mutual friend, Lenny Murphy, who introduced us some years ago. Lenny from the Greenbook. By the way, Lenny, if you're listening, I'm totally addicted to your Friday live podcast on LinkedIn with Karen Lynch. It's really excellent. It sucks me in every week. So really,
yeah. The story with that is you listen to it live on Friday night. I wake up on Saturday morning and listen to it with an espresso first thing on Saturday to get my weekend started. So
perfect. Excellent, cool. All right, so Dave, let's jump into it. I love your story. So let's take us way back. Just take us on the journey. So it wasn't advertising you wanted to study from the start. So give us the details.
Well, to be honest, I left school at 17, graduated high school and in Australia, and didn't know what I wanted to do. And after about 6 months of fumbling around other stuff, I sort of fell into a job at the local public library, and I stayed for 10 years. So I spent most of my late teens and 20s working at public libraries in Western Sydney. And while I was doing that, I was getting a couple of degrees at night. But yeah, I spent that time, and for a large part of that, I was a children's storyteller. So I would work in the children's branches of these libraries, and my job was primarily to sit on the floor and tell stories or read stories to kids.
Okay.
Which later in my career, I quite often say is the best training to be a presenter, storyteller, because it's the hardest audience in the world, right? If
Sure.
any of your audience have got little kids, you'll know keeping them happy for 20 minutes is a hard piece of work, right? So,
and if you're no good, they're not shy about letting you know that you suck.
yeah, no, exactly. And so I did that for 10 years, and then most of your audience won't know this. There's a law in Australia, right? It's called the long service rule. And basically what that means is if you're in the same job for 10 years, any job, public or private, by law, that organization at the end of 10 years has to give you 3 months bonus leave.
Oh,
so
okay. I wasn't aware of that.
So like most young Australians, when I hit the 10 years, when I was 28, I took off and spent 18 months backpacking around the world, worked as a butler in Rome, did a bunch of stuff.
Nice.
Ended back in Australia. And by the time I ended back in Australia, I was closing in on 30 and basically decided that being a children's storyteller might have had little pedophile overtones going to it to some people. So I decided, plus it wasn't making much money. So I was thinking about what to do. And a friend of mine rang me up one day and said, Dave, have you looked at page 19, bottom right-hand corner, Sydney Morning Herald, the major newspaper in Sydney?
Uh-huh.
And there was a little one of those little square inch wanted ads that, you know, if you're under about 35 now, you'll never have seen these. But in the old days, that's how you found out jobs, right?
Yeah.
And it just said, American company with 5 Australian offices wants to find somebody to help them understand Australians. Ring this number. Didn't say what the company was, didn't say what the industry was. So I rang the number, and it turned out got through to this lady who ended up becoming my boss. But she basically talked to me for a few minutes and then said, well, what do you know about advertising? I said, I know nothing. I have no idea about advertising. And she said, well, why do you want a job here? And I said, I just want a job, you know.
Yeah.
And she said, well, you know, if you know nothing about advertising, you probably never heard of McCann, which was the agency, right? And I said, well, actually, I have, because one of my 2 degrees was in political science, and I'd done my major paper on a very famous Australian political campaign that had been done by McCann. Wow. And although she didn't believe it at first, she got me to go in and meet the guy who was the head creative director for the company in Australia, who years before had written that ad campaign. And he kindly spent an hour and a half talking political history with me. And then I went home and sort of, I don't know if I got a job or not. Anyway, I ended up getting the job, and joined McCann, and partly because of my librarian skills, but they eventually it sort of evolved into what we now call strategic planning. And I was very lucky because I was the first person in Australia for that company to ever be trained and sent overseas to get training as a planning director. And then, you know, did some night school stuff and market research, did the Australians, what's now called the Research Society in Australia, did their night course for beginners and all that sort of stuff, and learn how to write a survey and all the rest, right? And the rest was history.
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's interesting. So you mentioned that your librarian skills back then were attractive to the company. What was that all about? What was it specifically?
Well, you got to remember, this was in the 1980s, so about the time you were born, I guess, Matt. And so back in the 1980s,
not quite. I was born in the 70s.
Okay, well, I'm trying to be kind, but you know, knowing a little about your musical tastes, I can understand that. Yeah, but you know, back in the 80s, there was no internet. There was nothing like we have now, like the Googles of the world, stuff like that, right? You did have online databases, and most people may have forgotten about some of these, but you had online databases that were very specialized in certain industries, etc. And of course, then there was libraries as well, and we all used to find out stuff from libraries. So one of the things that I was employed to do was collect the information that was put out. So all the trade magazines, not just in the advertising, marketing, market research world, but also in our clients' world. So supermarket magazines, et cetera, and then basically clip those to create files on every subject you could imagine that could possibly come up. So I had a file on yogurt, I had a file on cat food, I had a file on, you know, housewife trends, or, you know, all this sort of stuff, some of which may be politically incorrect to say today, but, you know, it was there. And then also use these databases. I mean, it was bizarre that when I first got there, there was a room, in a back room, that was about, I don't know, about 5 to 7 yards by 5 to 7 yards square. In the middle of it was literally a small table, a single chair, and a desktop computer. And that was the computer that you used to search databases on. And I was the only one with a key to the room. And we had 5 offices across Australia. And my job was to basically help people in those offices with clients or potential clients, look at that sort of stuff. Look at what they needed to know, what was available, crossover between different studies that I could find, do a lot of that sort of what I never understood, why it was called secondary research. I still don't understand why market researchers call the thing you should do first secondary research, because surely that's the primary research. And then if you do a survey, that's secondary, unless you're really dumb, right? Because only the dummies have not done proper research, book research, magazine, online research first, right? Anyway, that grew into my then getting more and more involved in running focus groups, both undertaking surveys and then putting together surveys, and integrating all of that into the planning department. And eventually I did that for 9 years in Sydney and then got transferred to Asia. They said, why don't you go to Asia for 2 years? And I've been living in Asia for nearly 30 now. So I guess that sort of 2 years got extended, right? So, but that's what I was doing, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think back about my first client side role. I worked for what is now Thomson Reuters, and there was a lot of grumbling in the department that it was kind of like a dead end, right? So if you were to rise throughout the company, you needed to have a background in sales. You needed to be in front of customers.
Right.
But you really kind of started from the bottom as having the key to the data vault. And then you rose through strategic planner, managing director. So tell me a little bit about that. I'm so curious what the
I ended up
process.
Yeah, I ended up the head of strategy for Australia for McCann, and then I'd initiated some interesting, at the time, innovative research. So one of the things was we had a research program called THROB, THROB, which was literally a double entendre, because we were trying to understand. It was to understand the pulse of young Australia, but also to understand sex in young Australia. So we called it THROB. Now, part of that was because we had a client called Durex, the condom manufacturer, but we had a lot of other youth-oriented clients, Levi's, Coca-Cola, etc. Right. And that program, it consisted of me going and spending an afternoon most weeks in a teenager's bedroom. And so I would find somebody in a working class suburb, in outer working class suburb of Sydney or Melbourne. I'd find Matt, and I'd call up Matt and I'd say, Matt, I'm going to come visit you next week on Thursday afternoon after you finish school, mate. Can you have a couple of your mates at your place? And there'd be 2 or 3 guys or 2 or 3 girls sitting in a bedroom. And part of it was me talking to them. Part of it was ethnographic, because I was really taking notes on what posters were on the walls, what records, because it was all albums then. So what records they had, what music they were playing. I get them to actually play music, and we'd sit around and sort of just listen to albums and talk about, why they like this and that. And all of that was seen as really innovative stuff. And we used to do some really innovative reporting. I mean, one of the things we did this was in the days when everybody had cassette players, right? So, and we used to make those mixed tapes. Maybe you probably made a mixtape when you were young, right?
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we did was, I got one of the youngest members of our staff to work with me on this, and we spent weeks talking to kids in all over the different working class up to upper middle class suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, the 3 big cities. But what we were taking away was, what music did they really like? What were the genres that were really topical? And what was 2 or 3 good examples of those genres? And what were kids interpreting from that music? But also, what was the music actually saying? And then we put together a mixed tape. But the mixed tape we had broke down to 5 major popular genres at the time. And punk, for example, etc. Right? And what we then did was, we intermixed 2 or 3 tracks of that representing that genre, but also with interviews, comments from these kids about, why did they really love, the Saints, which was Australia's #1 punk band. What was really great about the Saints? What did their songs mean? And why did it stick it to their parents if they were listening to this, right? So we did a lot of stuff. And then we sent those cassettes to all of our clients with a message to say, just play it, because everybody had a cassette player in their car then, right? So it's just, when you're stuck in traffic, just play this and listen to this, right? So we did a lot of innovative stuff like that. And the result of all that was I got increasing number of requests from the regional management of the company to go and do some sessions in our offices in different parts of Asia, help different Asian markets look at how to do something similar. And eventually I got asked to go, listen, go live in Asia for 2 years, helped set up planning departments all across Asia, helped set up a program like this. And we changed the name to Pulse because outside of Australia, the double entendre of throb didn't go down well. So we called it Pulse, but we didn't just do teens. We actually did 4 life stages. We did what we called identity builders, which was teens, college students. We did career builders, career builders were people in the first 10 years of their working life. So basically 20s, early 30s. Right. Then family builders, which was obviously people from about late 20s through to mid 40s when they were, having kids, growing up with their kids, mortgages. And then what we called new life builders, which was people 55 plus. And across 22 cities across Asia Pacific, every week in those 22 cities, somebody from our staff would be interviewing one of those 4 groups of people. And the subject was very open. Like literally, usually it was a 2-hour little focus group or sit in people's houses or again, sit in their bedrooms or their workspaces. Right. But the conversation would only have like a two-line moderator's guide. It would be very, very broad-based. And it just was just report back where it goes. And then we would aggregate these into reports and then figure out how that would help our teams create better advertising for our clients, and that became that got expanded. It became the global program for McCann, and McCann Pulse in a slightly different format still exists within that global ad agency. So that was, and so I stuck with McCann. Our first place I got shifted to was here in Bangkok. I was here for 5 years, ended up running the office for a while, got shifted to Hong Kong because we were trying to put a real focus on Hong Kong and China. So I got shifted there, spent 4 years there, 10 years in Tokyo, and then back in Hong Kong again. All of that, for most of that, running the planning division around the region, as well as maybe office management, stuff like that on top as well. And then 2015, I left McCann and started my own little consultancy where I just freelance around the region on all sorts of weird and wonderful projects that people ask me to get involved in.
Yeah, I love it. It's such a great story. And, one of the things that really strikes me, I think about, back then around that period of time, as you're describing the type of research that you're doing, it feels extremely forward thinking for that point in time. And also, especially in the Asia Pac region, because, a lot of the early research I've done in that region was really quite rudimentary. Really leaning in so much into the psyche, of the consumer.
Yeah, when we first got it all started, it was seen as really different. I mean, it was done for specific reasons. It was generated and sort of caught on because, and fortunately, one of our biggest clients globally was Coca-Cola, and literally some of the regional and country managers in Coca-Cola really loved what we were doing. And so we'd encourage their own teams to ask for our local teams, what's this going on about this? And, I think it doesn't matter whether you're with a research agency, an ad agency, or, any form of marketing agency. If your clients are keen on something, it helps the momentum move up, right? Yeah. And they liked it because nobody else was doing this stuff. Everybody else was doing traditional focus groups, traditional surveys. The idea of just having very open-ended discussions where it might be that, the discussion might be literally, okay, we're going to spend the next hour and a half. My only question is, why the hell do so many young guys wear black T-shirts, right?
Yeah.
And we just let that go, right? And see where that went, right? But you'd find out an amazing amount of stuff. The other thing I should have mentioned was that when we did these discussions, it wasn't just my planners or the very few trained market researchers we had. It was everybody on the staff had to take turns doing this. So whether you were a creative director or an account director, we even used to get the cleaners involved. I used to get the cleaners to moderate discussions, right? Yeah. And then tell me what happened, right? So all of that was quite innovative, and it caught on fortunately in the McCann world. It was a good time for that. But it also allowed me to have something different to talk about when I went to ESOMAR conferences or later, or many years later, when I started going to Greenbook's IX conferences and get involved with them and different industry things. So that now in the years since I've been doing my own thing, probably a third of what I do is get asked to storytelling or about how to be more innovative in finding out what matters to people, right? So, it paid off in the end.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I love the fact that you're pushing the envelope, and I'm going to think more about this example of, hey, why are guys wearing black t-shirts, right? You just pick like a cultural touchstone like this, and I could see how it would just open up
Yeah,
so many areas.
it's always sliding doors, isn't it, Matt? Right? Everything in your career, everything is a sort of sliding door. I was very lucky in the first year when I joined McCann. They subscribed to a newsletter from a guy named Hugh McKay. And unless you're Australian, you never heard of this guy, but in Australia, he's considered the father of social and market research.
Okay.
And he used to do this monthly newsletter that you had to buy, which was every month was a subject, but basically just run focus groups, but very broad focus groups related to a subject. And Hugh taught me a valuable lesson very early on in my career when he explained to me that he believed that if you're running a focus group and you're the moderator, a good moderator should have to say nothing for the second hour, literally nothing, because you should have generated so much discussion, it just goes off and you just see where it goes. So if you're interested in, why people are drinking orange fizzy water, you start with that, but then see where it goes. And that's where you're going to find the more valuable stuff for selling orange fizzy water, right? Because if you ask people stupid questions like, why do you like that brand versus that brand? You get stupid answers because nobody really thinks that way, right?
Right. Yeah, I love it. So from your perspective, I mean, always kind of being on the forefront of where this industry is going and not afraid to try new things, as you look at the future, especially with this perspective from Asia Pac, as you look towards the future of research, what does that look like? What do you see there?
Oh, look, I think it's funny, isn't it? Because I think last year, because of the GPT thing, it was one of those moments where a lot of people sort of freaked out. And, even this last week, in the last week, I sat through 2 different seminars where I've just sat there and listened to people talking about AI and generative things and all this sort of stuff. And I'm actually co-hosting Greenbook's IEX Asia Pac conference in 2 weeks' time here in Bangkok.
Oh, cool.
And we've got some speakers that will talk about that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
What scares me is that everybody is so focused on that they're losing track of what else is going on.
Right.
And so, one of the things that I think Asia is catching up on and will continue to catch up on is the technical side in some ways. I think, there's no doubt America is still probably the leading location for using technology in market research. But what I'm seeing is a lot of innovation. And, if I can take AI for an example, the biggest thing that worried me last year in the market research world was listening to webinars, going to conferences, and people were talking about as if AI had been invented on January the 1st, 2023.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like this GPT thing was like, oh shit, AI, wow, and I'm going, well, I've been an independent consultant since 2015, and I've been using 2 different AI platforms for market that are specifically built for market research and using them very successfully for 8 years. Why haven't more of you guys? And the problem was, up until the beginning of last year, most people in the market research world, when I presented these things at conferences, would go, yeah, but that'll never replace, it's not really good. And I'd go, yeah, but we've got all the correlations to show that the results we're getting are actually better than traditional formats, traditional tools, right? Like surveys and things. But what we were finding is that people were just sort of like, yeah, but it's whatever. And then suddenly, and this is what worries me, is that the market research industry in my 35 years involved in it is extremely overreactive to trends. The industry goes nuts on trends. Remember, think about now where different industry organizations, different major players in the industry love to call themselves the insights industry or an insights company. And you go, that's ridiculous, because most of what you do is not that insightful. I like to say, somebody asked me this question last week, and I said, look, I probably personally either undertaken or initiated 2,000 research studies in my career. And I can tell you the 10 insights that I've encountered in 2,000 studies.
Yeah.
99% of research studies don't create an insight. They create interesting most of them create interesting findings,
right,
but they don't create a real insight.
mm-hmm.
But we've got carried away with the word insights, in the same way that, unfortunately, in the 80s and early 90s, we got, the industry got carried away with Gen X, Gen Y, Gen whatever it is now, Gen Alpha, right? And this mentality that generations are fundamentally different, and we go looking for the differences, when if you stand back and look at market research studies, and in the room next door I've got studies going back to the 1960s, for example, on what we might call youth cultures, etc., and you'll find that basically nothing has changed. They're interested in the same things.
Yeah, it's more life stage rather than generation.
It's life stage. Unfortunately, and I've been talking about life stages for the last couple of years, fortunately, what I'm starting to see here in Asia, and it may be the case in America, but certainly in Asia, there are some people that are now more actively going, no, put that aside. Let's focus on the life stages, and let's focus on how similar life stages are across generations.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are minor tactical differences. So, I know you'll get onto music at the end of the end of this thing, but think about music. When were young people not really into music, right? In the last 100 years, yes, it might be that you're either the Black Sabbath generation, or you're the In Excess generation, or you're a Swiftie.
Yeah.
But I literally, while I was waiting to start this, I was watching somebody get interviewed, and he's actually a football coach in Australia getting interviewed, but he was talking about the fact that his daughters, somebody asked him in the interview, are you a Swiftie? And he goes, no, but my daughters are. And he said, it's just exactly, but the way they're reacting is exactly the way me and my girlfriend reacted when the Beatles toured in 1964.
Yeah.
And so it is exactly the same thing. It's just, it's a good looking blonde American woman versus four guys with mop head haircuts from Liverpool, right? Yeah. But the actual way it's all rolling out is the same.
I have a question about this. I have a hypothesis, and that's the only level it's at currently. I have no data to support it yet, and I'm just interested in your take on it. Because I agree with you. I buy into that notion that it's about life stage. With music specifically, the one thing that feels a little bit different is that it feels like the youth now doesn't necessarily base their entire identity on the type of music that you listen to. Like, think about it. High school, it was metalheads versus Darksiders or goths, versus.
Sorry, but Matt, wherever you are right now, go to 3 high schools tomorrow in your area and look out for the Swifties.
Yeah, you're right.
Or given I just saw, didn't Ye just launch a new album that's just become his 11th #1 album or something, right? The way it manifests is slightly different. I'm not too sure It is different fundamentally. I think the thing that, and one of the things that through the work I've been doing for the last 20 years that maybe in terms of these life stages is different, that I like to now talk about, is historically around the world in every society, there were 3 life stages. There was childhood, adulthood, and really old, waiting to die, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere around the 1920s, we invented the teenage, because you were no longer a child, but you weren't an adult. And, first in, say, America and then expanding around the world, you spent 5, 6, 7, 10 years still sort of a kid going to school, college, or whatever, not having real adult responsibilities, etc. That sort of gap decade that you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the last 25, 30 years, we've seen two other life stages, because now we have a life stage that I first started noticing in the 90s, but in Asia, but has now become evident around the world, which is what I call new life builders, which is that age group between about 55 and 75.
Okay.
So think about it that, you were an adult until about 55, and then the kids have grown up.
Right.
You probably got close to paying off your mortgage. You're probably starting to think about, these days it's like, will I retire, not retire? When can I retire? What will I do? That sort of stuff. And then you do sort of retire, semi-retire, whatever. And the other thing you got to remember is at 55, 60, if you're in the States, if you're in Australia, if you're here in Thailand, if you're in Japan, if you're in China, at 55, 60, most people know today that if I hit 60, I'm probably going to live to be 85.
Yeah.
Right. On average.
Yep.
So therefore, that you have that sort of period of like, well, what am I going to do for the next 20 years?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's where we get into this whole thing of, the obvious things is like, guys like me, I took up tennis again 2 years ago after 30 years of not playing, right?
Sure.
Or you go pick up bicycling or whatever. But you also see people doing other smaller things to retry their life, as I like to call it.
Okay.
The other one, which is much newer, is the gap between being what I used to call a career builder. So somebody in their first 10 years of their working life, in their 20s, right? Mm-hmm. When they're usually single adults. But now we have the extended 20s.
Yeah.
The extended 20s is those people in their 30s and 40s who maybe are still living at home, have decided not to have kids, have decided not to get married, have decided to treat their dog as their kid, most classically, right? And the category that really brings this home a lot is, of course, the pet food and pet care industry, where we've seen an explosion in that industry in the last 20 years. And the reason for that explosion is more and more people that are in their late 20s through to their 40s that don't have kids and spending the money there, right? Yeah. But they also spend more money proportionally. In the old days, remember, to go back to the music analogy, in the old days, somewhere in your late 20s, you stop spending so much money on music, like going to gigs, going to concerts, buying music, right? Because you had other priorities, like maybe you were saving for a mortgage or, or whatever it was. But that's not slowing down. They're not going necessarily to concerts, but they're still really interested in whatever their music is. They're still investing in their music. So we've seen the number of life stages have maybe expanded, and maybe your dog is actual proof of the fact that you're still an extended 20. I don't know, perfect timing.
It was.
But what's interesting is from the Asia perspective is that a lot of this stuff, in the old days, when I got started in the industry, when you got started in the industry, it didn't matter where you were in the world. Basically, trends came, you thought trends came from the States or maybe from Western Europe. And now, of course, we understand that even things like demographic trends, demographic reality, socioeconomic trends, the way in which we're going to eat, the way we're going to use makeup, etc. Nearly all the major trends that you think are topical in the States are actually 10 years old in Asia.
Yeah.
And you can go through category after category after category. You're going to find that, no, but somewhere in Asia, they were doing that 10 years ago. They were eating that. They were wearing that makeup. They were dressing like that. The designers, think about the music industry, think about the entertainment industry, and so much of the stuff. I always love watching American Ninja, right?
Yeah.
Well, partly because I'm a student of Japanese history. I can't see what that program's got to do with ninjas who were assassins who preferred poison more than anything else as their means of killing people. I mean, you just see so much of this. And what's interesting is sitting here in Bangkok, which is a sort of middle point for Asia, not just geographically in the middle, but socioeconomically and everything.
Sure.
And then getting to travel. I spent a lot of time in Japan, in Bangladesh. So, from the most advanced countries in Asia to the still really developing countries like a Bangladesh. And you get to see how those trends are developing, and then what that means in terms of what they might be spreading around the world, right? And how that's sort of affecting things in other marketplaces. So it's very cool.
Sure. Yeah, it is interesting because I know you mentioned entertainment. You know, my wife is really into Korean dramas.
Right.
My kids are all into anime.
Yeah, right.
That's most of what they consume from an entertainment standpoint. It's really
Yeah, right. I mean, if you think about it, you know, we've all since 1964, kids in the West have been watching anime. The original one was Astro Boy, right, which was launched in 1964 as a precursor to the Tokyo Olympics as part of the Tokyo government's effort to make Japanese brands popular, right? Yeah, and then the Korean government in 1992 sat down with the chaebols, the six big Korean corporations, and said, let's copy that trick. Let's spread pop culture from Korea. So they literally, not only did they give away those soap operas, they used to pay TV stations to play the soap operas and then tell them, oh, you can still charge for the ad space in between as well. So it was double profit for the TV stations, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, Korean singers, the spooky movies. But we're also seeing that now in America, for example, with Bollywood, right? And the explosion of interest in Bollywood movies.
Totally.
And of course, Indian corporations are helping to fund those things because it's great. Because if you like Indian soft culture, that will persuade you that maybe Indian brands of different type are cool, right?
Yeah.
And it helps, of course, if you also have food that everybody likes, right? So, you know, the other thing is the great explosion of Asian cuisines. I mean, when you think about when you were in elementary school, did your parents ever take you to a Thai restaurant, a Korean restaurant? No, it didn't exist, right? I don't think
there was one in St.
No, there wasn't, right? There wasn't. And then so there's that background thing going on. And then suddenly you find out that your wife or your girlfriend is using Korean cosmetics, you know, et cetera, right? And off it goes. And so we're seeing that shift. Who would have, for example, who would have imagined 10 years ago that a Chinese brand will be the #1 selling brand of motor cars in the world? Nobody. But they are. Now, they may not be on the streets of New York or Denver, but around the world, they're now the #1 selling, you know, China's now got the 3 biggest growth brands in the motor car industry. And it's exploding, right?
It's fascinating. Fascinating. All right, so we're talking about media and you're sitting in Bangkok. I'm curious to know what media you're consuming on a regular basis. Can be, you know, for insight, inspiration, or enjoyment. Big broad question.
First of all, I have to say I love going to the movies. Always love going to the movies. The good thing about Thailand is that most of the American blockbusters actually launch here the same week as they do in the States. So
cool.
I get to see the latest Avengers movie or whatever it might be, the topical. Oppenheimer opened here the same week as it did in the States, right? Yeah. Which I thought was a Barbie I got, but I didn't think Oppenheimer would, but actually it did. And it ran for a few weeks and I got to see that. So I go to the movies quite a lot, not only to see American flicks, but, you know, to see some of the other stuff that's happening around the world. I'm a huge football, real, not the stuff you play at the Super Bowl, real football, the global game. I'm a huge football fan. And then, of course, Asia is a huge football market. So literally the first thing I do every morning is go to the Guardian newspaper site from England and look at the football news there. Yeah. And then I go to ESPN's football coverage, as in real football, and listen to the clips for that every day. I do spend quite a bit of time on browsing a whole bunch of different types of websites. So I like to look at our industry sites, both the market research ones, you know, the Greenbook sites and that sort of stuff that probably all your viewers look at. But also I love to look at what's coming up and out of the trends that are coming out of trend reports that are coming out from all sorts of organizations these days. One of my favorites is the Global Wellness Institute, which is based in New York, which does an amazing array of reports on the very broad, what they now classify as wellness, which covers a whole bunch of industries. But also specialist organizations. One of my favorite websites is the WTO, right?
Yep.
Not the World Trade Organization, but the WTO that's based in Singapore, which is the World Toilet Organization.
Okay.
Which is an organization funded by a fantastic guy named Jack Sim, a Singaporean multimillionaire who gave up his business when he turned 40 to help solve the world's biggest health problem, which is the lack of toilets.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I look for a lot of niche sites like that to look for reports on what you might call niche industries or niche topics, to really understand what's going on and is topical around those things and how they overlap. And believe it or not, I actually read the Bangkok Post, which is the #1 English language newspaper, most days. I actually read the actual, what do you call it, the actual newspaper?
Yeah, the physical paper.
Because I am a bibliosexual. I like actual media, right? So all sorts of things.
Okay, Dave, you know, you're a music fan, I'm a music fan, so it's time for us to talk rock and roll. And so you know what question's coming, but I have to ask about something first. Now, I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, you know, the land of Prince,
Yes.
who was rumored to play a high school dance at my high school. I was never able to confirm that. It would have been, you know, a couple years before I was there, but you have an actual story of a band playing at your high school dance. So tell us about that.
Well, as I said to you before we started, when you told me you were going to ask me for my 3 songs for the desert island, right?
Yeah.
The first one that comes to mind is one, and I checked in with my son and daughter, both adults, live in Sydney, but I was on a phone call with them a couple of days ago, and we got into this big family debate about my 3 songs. And they reminded me that there can only one of them had to be an AC/DC number because I was fortunate enough. AC/DC, well, Angus and Malcolm, the 2 founders of AC/DC, were brought up. You know, they were Scottish immigrants to Australia, but when they were young kids. But they grew up about 3 suburbs away from where I grew up, in the western working class suburbs of Sydney.
Wow.
And so by the time I was finishing high school, they were playing the gigs that we were going to before they had an album, right? So school dances and the local pubs and stuff like this. And then of course, suddenly we used to have a Saturday night Top of the Pops type program in Australia. It was called Countdown. It was a compulsory for every young Australian from 6 till 7 on Saturday night on the ABC station in all the big cities. You had to watch Countdown. And it was the early days before MTV of, you know, music clips and stuff like this. And suddenly there were these guys, because by that stage Bon Scott had joined them, and they were Akadaka, as we know. In Australia, they're called Akadaka. I don't know if you know that, right?
I don't know that term.
No, you know.
Akadaka, AC/DC. Okay.
AC/DC, Akadaka.
Okay, cool.
But the song that's always really, I mean, there's a couple of their songs that really stuck with me, but one has always been, It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll.
Yes, I love that song. Yeah.
Which, if you know the song, you know, halfway through the song, suddenly Bon starts playing the bagpipes. In the original film clip, they actually had real traditional Scottish bagpipe players in the background playing, right? And it was just, I mean, people always say this, and I get it, you know, when different bands come on board and suddenly create what you might call a new genre or whatever, right? But seriously, you know, AC/DC were, what the hell is, you know, this was amazing. This was fantastic. And of course, you know, you had Angus in his schoolboy outfit, and he looked about 12, and, you know, it was just the noise level and everything. So, you know, that's AC/DC's definitely out there. You know.
Hey, one last question about AC/DC. When you saw them before they even had an album out, did you have a sense for, wow, these guys are going to be something?
You had a sense that you had a sense that, what the hell is this? Right?
Right.
I mean, you know, like every, I guarantee, whether it was, you know, in Minnesota or any decent sized city in America, you had at that time bands, right? And some of those bands went on to become major bands, and some slipped off the surface of the earth, whatever.
Yeah.
And we had bands like that too. And some of those bands went on to become globally famous.
Yeah.
But AC/DC were partly because they were. I like to say they were the grunge before grunge. Because if you actually look at them in the early days, I mean, no offense, but they are not good-looking guys.
No, not at all.
They were scraggy as all hell, right?
Yeah.
And so you sort of had this, but they came from the same world I did. I mean, my parents were immigrants from the UK. They grew up in these real working class suburbs in Western Sydney.
Yeah.
They appealed to that, which is sort of the demographic core, if you like, of Australia, is that in those three big cities we have, the western suburbs is always where the working class is, the hard pubs are, the hard gigs were, and you went out and you banged your head, and you banged your head hard. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so AC/DC, long way to the top. That's what else you got?
Change focus, okay? But around that same time, my favorite album of all time came out, which is called Yellow Brick Road. Elton John.
Yes. And
there's a track on that, Saturday Night's All Right, which was a sort of anthem for Saturday night. I mean, once that song came out and that album broke, like when you were with your mates, it's in somebody's car going in those days to the local disco or the local place where you went, or the local pub where you went to see bands. You played that at some point, right? Because it was like the thing to get you in the mood for Saturday night. It's very fast paced, whatever. It's great. And if you think about it, AC/DC and that particular album all became famous roughly in 1974 in the same year. And it was the two different sort of movements going on in young guys' worlds, right? At that time, teenagers' worlds, right? It was like, oh shit, this is, and look at Elton John, like he's a freak, if you think about it. Like the AC/DC guys were like, we're just like them, but they can actually play music.
Yeah.
Elton John, what the hell is that? And so it was attractive because it was like, what the hell is that, right? So that was and go back to market research. Years later, when I first started work at McCann, never having worked in an ad agency before, after a few months, I finally got the courage up to go up to our top creative director, who had written some globally award-winning ads for Coca-Cola, Levi's, other big brands. And I said, look, can I don't even know if he'd ever talked to me at that point, right? And then it was sort of like, hey, I'm the relatively new guy. Look, can we just have a coffee? Yeah, or what? And he goes, well, can you just explain to me, like, how do you make a really successful TV commercial? And he said, well, the number one rule is simple. Your job, Dave, is to find out exactly who the target is. And don't describe young guys who are in dinner. I want to know exactly how old they are, what year they are. Are they 19-year-olds? Okay. Are they 28-year-olds? Are they 36-year-old housewives? Are they 45-year-old business people? Who's the target? How old are they? And then I go back to when they were 18. You find out what the number one record is, and you either buy the track, but unfortunately, if it's the Rolling Stones, you probably can't afford that. So you either dummy it up or you get something really close to it and make that the backing track for the ad. And if you think about that, I use that as a rule. So as I traveled around and was based in different countries, when I moved to Tokyo, I got the most junior guy in our office who was really into music and bands. And I said, I want you to do this. We had 900 staff in this ad agency, right? And I said, I want you to take this main wall in one of the offices, a big wall, and I wanted you to create a poster. I wanted you to go back 60 years. And for every year, I want you to put up what was the number one song, the number one movie, the number one TV show, and who was the number one sports star for that year for 60 years.
Yeah.
So that everybody in the company had this constant reference of Matt's 40, right? That when he was 18, this was the band, this was the movie, da-da-da.
Yeah.
And it's the simplest piece of research to do, but the most effective, right?
Yeah, that's
But my third song has nothing to do with any of that.
Okay.
My dad was a mad fan of musicals. and one of his favorite movies was Singing in the Rain.
Okay.
And there's a song in that, not Singing in the Rain, but there's a song in that musical that I terrorized my kids throughout their whole growing up, because even as teenagers, 8 o'clock Saturday morning, the song Good Morning, Good Morning, which is sung by Gene Kelly, Debbie Reynolds, and Donald O'Connor, that went on full blast throughout the apartment, and they had to wake up to that every Saturday morning of their teenage, right? I love it. So I figured if you're going to be on a desert island, you might as well get 3 loud and upbeat songs that are really going to keep you pumped, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise you're going to cut your throat. So.
All right, Dave. I love it. I love it. And I hope we can share pints sometime in the future. If I get over there, you get over here. Let's make it happen, because
yeah, come on out. Everybody's welcome in Bangkok. So.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Dave. It's been a great chat. Let's definitely talk soon and rock and roll.
Rock and roll, man. Rock and roll. Cheers.